Hello, I'm Chris Jones, Director of Tax Markets at Tolley, and I'm joined today in this webinar by Carolyn Steppler, Private Client Partner at Ernst & Young. Hello, Carolyn.
Hello, Chris.
So today we're going to be talking about the statutory residence test, and as many of you know, this has added a fair number of pages into the Tolley Yellow and Orange handbooks which we publish. And there's so much in the statutory residence test that we thought it would be useful to get a webinar out there to explain why we have published a book on this topic. So, Carolyn, as you're the writer of this book, can you tell us what is the statutory residence test?
Okay, Chris. Well, the statutory residence test, or let's call it the SRT for shorthand, is a very comprehensive test now set out in the legislation to enable taxpayers to determine whether they are tax resident or not. Previously, all we had really was some case law and revenue guidance, which didn't have the status of statute. This comprehensive legislation, as you say, it's about 60 pages of legislation, will now give a more objective test to enable taxpayers to determine whether they're resident or not.
So, in some senses, and I think one of the things that taxpayers found in the past was when we had all the plethora of cases that were coming through, things became a little bit muddled, didn't they? Because it was very difficult to advise a client exactly whether they would be resident or not. So would it be fair to say that with regard to this test, it is more objective, it does create that certainty that is sought by clients?
You're certainly right that the previous regime was very flexible and very fluid. Now, sometimes that worked to the advantage of the taxpayer because you were able to take a position based on the case law rather than on very, very rigid tests. However, as you make reference to all of those cases, it certainly gave a lot of uncertainty, and we've certainly seen that a lot over the last few years. What I think the legislation has done is set out very, very objective tests, but they're very, very rigid. And that gives a certain element of certainty, but it also makes it quite challenging for taxpayers too.
So in a sense, it might be easier to come to an answer as to whether your client is resident or not, but more likely that they are with rigid tests. In fact, you might not like the answer, but at least you can come to one.
I think that's right. I mean, in some areas it's now very, very certain, but there's still quite a lot of uncertainty around some of the definitions, and that I think is where we're going to see some of the challenges in the future.
So, Carolyn, why do we have we had this test introduced because of the uncertainty? Is that what it all sprung from, and this is what the government want to try and clarify for everyone, or has there been other motivations behind it?
I think it's partly because of the self-assessment system. So taxpayers need to self-assess their resident status, and with all this uncertainty it's been very difficult to do so. I think there's been attempts to introduce an SRT for quite a number of years. I mean, it's as early as 1936 we first had a parliamentary commission saying we should have a statutory residence test. So it's taken a very long time to get on the statute books. But I think certainly it's the uncertainty and the need for self-assessment. That's why we've got this new rules.
Yes, because self-assessment, by having a regime like self-assessment, you do need that. So taxpayers need to know what they are actually assessing. So what are the key principles of the statutory residence test, or SRT?
Well, the test now has three parts. So the first part is the automatic non-resident test. And if you fall within that, you're non-resident, and that's the end of the story. If you don't fall within that, you move on to the residence test. Those are the tests which determine whether you're automatically resident or not. And if you fall within that, that's the end of the story. However, there will be many taxpayers who don't fall within either of those two parts. So the third part is for them. That's called the sufficient ties test, and it looks at the connection factors they have with the UK and the number of days they spent here. And that's when how you determine whether you're resident or not.
Okay, so you're either definitely resident, and that's the end of it. Definitely not resident, and that's the end of it. But if, as many clients' affairs will be somewhere in the middle, somewhere sort of not black or white but in that grey area, then you have to look at whether they've got sufficient ties with the UK that essentially determines them as resident in the UK?
That's right, and I suspect we'll probably have a lot of people who fall within that third category. But I think the most important thing is actually to get across that the first part is, are you automatically non-resident or not? And I think it's that priority for non-residents, which is a new departure, and I think will be very helpful for taxpayers in the future.
And with the rules being clear, because there's a clear definition of whether you are or you are not resident, then once you've essentially satisfied the test that you are not resident, you don't need to look at ties.
Exactly, that's exactly right. So for example, if you've been resident in one of the previous 3 years and you limit your days to 15 days in the UK, you're automatically non-resident, and that's the end of the story.
So it really does help taxpayers when they actually know from their facts how many days they can have here, and once they step over, they might be thinking, well, actually, if I step into a higher number of days and I've got X number of ties, that could make me resident. So that does enable taxpayers to plan their affairs more effectively.
I think it does, and I think especially when you're focusing on the day test, that's when you get the simplicity. But it's when you move outside the day test to some of the other tests, for example, do you have a home in the UK? And that's where some of the complications will arise. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of uncertainty about some of the tests, and I just wish we'd only focused on a day count test. It would have been so much simpler.
So the ties test, I mean, this is the piece that I find the hardest area here. That's where the rules, although themselves, you can determine the ties, but actually determining whether you actually have a tie in the UK is quite complex.
It certainly is. I mean, it's things like whether a minor child is a tie or not. I find even now I still have to go back all the time to the legislation just to check the number of conditions. And I feel that if you can't even give a broad opinion without going back to the detail, that's when a test really isn't simple enough.
So, I think we've established that the rules are, in framework, simple enough, but in the devil is in the detail. So that leads me sort of to the question, really, Carolyn.
Yeah.
You've written the book for us. So how do you think Tolley's statutory residence test will help practitioners to unravel this minefield?
Well, I think the book will certainly help people save time, because what we've done is we've read the legislation, we've read the HMRC guidance, and I think it's worth noting we've already got over 100 pages of HMRC guidance. You think about that, that just shows that this is not that simple a test. And what we've done is we've put the two together, so practitioners won't have to just do that raw research themselves. What we've then done is tried to take some examples. Now, in the revenue guidance, there's quite a lot of examples, but they're pretty clear cut. They're almost the kind of example you say, I'd never meet that in practice. What we've tried to do with our examples is go beyond the simple, and so to illustrate some of the more complexities of the new regime, and try and give our understanding of where we think, where the line we would come down on. So I think that's helpful. And then the other thing we've done is we've got 4 very practical chapters. We've got chapters on employees coming to the UK and employees leaving the UK, and the high net worth individual, or really everyone else coming and leaving the UK. And we've tried to put the whole thing together. So how would you advise your client in that circumstance? How does the split year work? How do the years of complete non-residence work? And so I think we've made the book very, very practical as we can when we're still only in the first months of the new regime.
So bringing it all together in one place, the legislation, the guidance, and I've certainly read some of the HMRC examples, and I was looking and thinking, that's easy to advise on that one, that is very clear cut. But actually, when practitioners really get into it, it's going to be those situations that are less clear, where actually you just want a blueprint. And the Tolley book, I think, will certainly provide that extra guidance that people will need to get them to the answer that they need for their clients.
Well, that's what we're certainly hoping for, Chris.
Excellent. Well, many thanks for joining me today, Carolyn. I hope the webinar has been useful, but more importantly, I hope that when you do look at the book, you'll realise that actually there is a lot in there to help you wade through what is complex legislation, but in an area of tax, as Carolyn was saying earlier, that we do need to self-assess on, and actually providing that certainty that you'll need to give advice to your clients. Many thanks for joining us. Goodbye.